brief history of musical sounds that will help in our future use of chords. If we were able to go back to the time of Henry VIII, we would no doubt be listening to music such as the famous Greensleeves, which some historians suggest he actually composed. By analysing the notes that occupy the important places, we find the melody to entirely consist of the first or the third or the fifth notes of the chord. 1, 3 and 5, 5, 3, 3, 3, 1, 1, 5, 3, 1. If we were to take other tunes of Henry VIII's reign, we would find the same numbers being used all the time. Now, up in bonnie Scotland, melodies were also based upon the first, the third or the fifth notes of chord in important places. 1, 1 and 3, 1, 3, 5. Things sounded slightly different north of the border because so much did the canny Scots like the sound of fifths in particular, they deliberately tuned their beloved bagpipes to that note, and by making it into a constant drone it became virtually impossible to hear the proper tune. Fifths caught on so much that in monasteries all over the world, the monks raved it up to harmonies of the fifth and nothing else. The Chinese copied this idea but took liberties and inverted the fifths, so they sounded like fourths. Note-wise, music didn't change much over the centuries, and coming up to Victorian times, the family would spend Sunday afternoons in the front parlour still playing and listening to 1s and 3s and 5s forming the melody in important places. Even the famous Scott Joplin in 1897 couldn't get away from 1s and 3s and 5s. It wasn't until the advent of blues in New Orleans at the turn of the century that a new note emerged, the sound of the seventh in important places. That sound of sevenths is what makes the blues, and it can be said to be the very birth note of jazz and modern music. Blues originally started as sad music played for funeral processions. Although the tempo would have been stepped up somewhat on the way back from the cemetery, in order to get to the party on time. Older Victorians must have been horrified at hearing this new sound of the seventh, which their ears had never been used to. But given time, it became accepted. Even so, our brave troops marching off with the intent of wiping out the German army in the 1914-18 war were still singing just ones and threes and fives. Now that was 5, 5 and 5 and 3 and 5, 3, 3 and 5, 3, 5. It wasn't until the 14-18 war was over that music started to use happier sounds, although America had started it off with syncopated ragtime in 1912. And the blues seventh, now fully accepted, was joined by sharp fives in the sounds of the 20s. Notice how sharp fives take the chord change upwards, and therefore brightness is created. Lively tunes and dances such as the Charleston became fashionable, and in one such tune, the Black Bottom, we hear an even newer sound introduced, that of the ninth, which may well have been the very start of a new era. Did you spot the ninth? There it is. And there's another one. They say that the Black Bottom was composed by a Jewish tailor from New York by the name of Sidney Greenbaum, but he couldn't very well call it that. By the mid-30s and into the 40s, melodies were used in sixths and thirteenths. If you think about it, the 13th is only a sixth but played high above 7th. And music had developed from syncopated ragtime to sophisticated swing. The king of swing was the legendary Benny Goodman. Such new sounds and rhythms must have been very strange to the ears of older Edwardians. Glenn Miller's big band from the 40s featured a signature tune in which the very first note is a sixth. For a short while, every swing band used endings to their arrangements, which featured the sixth. Tunes such as Laura use ninths, sixths and thirteenths almost throughout, as these new sounds became established. Laura starts on a 9, which becomes a 13th, then a 9 and a 6, 9, 13th, and a 9th. Entering the 50s, swing became modern jazz, featuring flat ninths and sharp nines, and the very strange sound in flat and fifth. Jazz improvisation of this style became known as bebop. These flat and fifths at first sounded too unusual for some ears to accept, but as with all the other sounds we have mentioned, it became established after a while, and even a pretty melody like Moon River contains a flat and fifth, and they are now considered to be fairly normal, although it took a long time for their acceptance. Here it comes. Another one. Incidentally, classical music contains all the same sounds, including the flattened fifth. The music for Romeo and Juliet actually starts on a flattened fifth. If you listen carefully, you'll find a sharp 9 in the middle 8 bars of Misty. No, that was a flat 9. There it is. The mid-50s saw Bill Haley with Rock Around the Clock, closely followed by Elvis Presley, who was later to become known as the King, with Heartbreak Hotel. Their simple style of music tossed all sophistication aside and reverted to the original 3 chords used in the blues nearly 60 years beforehand, but played with a modern style beat. It became very popular with young would-be musicians, as they could buy a guitar, learn 3 chords, and immediately perform the music of the day. And so on. Thus was born rock and roll, or the 3-chord 12-bar blues reincarnated. And some time was to elapse before we were to hear the emergence of a 4th chord in Elvis records. As the popularity of rock and roll gained momentum, musical composition took a giant step backwards to using 1s and 3s, 5s and 7s only, with the simple chords that such notes come from, and was faced with the task of growing up all over again. However, there was a section of the musical world that was not prepared to forsake all the inventive and imaginative sounds that should be present in music. They were known as musicians, and by merging all good musical notes with a Latin American feel to provide a more exciting rhythmic approach, there was born the bossa nova. Bossa novas will always contain the special notes that stand out over and above ordinary run-of-the-mill 1, 3, 5, 7s. And it's these special notes with their harmonies which create imaginative musical invention. Even the flattened fifth, which came from modern jazz, will be featured in bossa novas. There's one. Fortunately, even in the world of pop music, tunes gradually began to appear which used more than 3 or 4 chords. The Beatles' Can't Buy Me Love, for instance, which was in the charts for 14 weeks in 1964, uses the same old 3 chords in its verse, but manages to call upon a further 3 in the chorus. Disregarding rock and roll's retrograde step, I have described how musical eras happened as different sounds were introduced and finally became accepted. The only new sounds still unused and therefore available to establish another era were those of the major seventh and the 11th, and the 70s saw the introduction of these sounds. F major 7, C major 9, G11, G11, major 7ths and 11ths are still very much the order of the day, and we can update chords which belong to past times by bringing in the 11th, as long as it doesn't conflict with the melody note. For instance, the chord of the 13th, used so much in the 40s and the 50s, and which we have seen to be built as 7, 8, 10, 13, could be updated by building it with the notes 7, 9, 11, 13. And this inclusion of the 11th makes it sound modern. So we have the old 13th, or the new 13th with the 9 and the 11 inside it, which updates it to today's times. There are no more new notes left which would create another step forward, and today's pop music has been forced to concentrate on bringing the rhythmical drum beat to the fore, as in the case of disco music.